All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Humentum's Operationalizing Locally Led Development webinar series. We are really excited to have you all joining us for today's conversation, Unlocking the Power of Flexible Funding. Before I turn it over to our wonderful moderator, Riva Kantowitz, who is founder of the Radical Flexibility Fund, I'd like to go over just a few housekeeping items and set the stage for our conversation today. Next slide, Helen. First, we would like to say thank you to our industry partners for their support in making convenings like today possible. Now we'd also like to highlight just a couple of upcoming events that you won't want to miss. Next slide, Helen. So upcoming on October 4th, we'll be co-hosting a webinar to delve into the results of the Bridge survey and explore what this means for DEI going forward in the global development sector. And we also invite you to join us again on October 11th for another installment of the Operationalizing Locally Led Development series. So be sure to register today to save your seat. Next slide, Helen. During the webinar, we invite you to put any questions, comments, and reflections in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat and sharing your questions with our panelists. Would also like to let you know that subtitles are available for this webinar, so you can turn them on by clicking the closed captioning button at the bottom of the screen. We've also started recording the webinar, and we will be sure to share the recording with you all in a follow-up email. So that's it for housekeeping on our end. And before we begin, I'd like to share just a few reflections from Humentum on the significance of this topic that we're discussing today. So, the conversation around flexible funding is hardly new, although we have definitely seen renewed interest across the sector in actually operationalizing full, fair, and flexible funding. This topic is at the core of our advocacy and movement building work at Humentum. Many of you have probably read our Breaking the Starvation Cycle report, which shared groundbreaking research on how nonprofit organizations are systematically underfunded and under-resourced when their overhead costs are not covered. The conversation around overhead coverage is certainly an important component of flexible funding, but it's not the only component. This conversation will explore various elements of flexible funding, and we will hear from our panel of experts on what steps their organizations have taken to implement and mainstream it across their operations. At Humentum, we're all about putting talk into action, so we certainly didn't want this to be yet another conversation around flexible funding that goes nowhere and leaves everybody here with more questions than answers. As our moderator Riva will share, we are facing really global challenges on an unprecedented scale that cannot be tackled without fully and flexibly resourcing local and national organizations. With that, I will turn it over to Riva to moderate this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Riva.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenna. Good morning, everyone from New York City. You may be able to hear a little bit of drilling in the background, which alerts you to being in Manhattan. So I hope that's not distracting. As Jenna said, my name is Riva Kantowitz, and I'm the founder of Radical Flexibility Fund, where we focus on innovative and sustainable pathways to support locally led social change. So thank you to Humentum for your partnership and continued excellent work on localization. As Jenna noted, this series is a continuation of last year's series, which was all about unpacking the operational barriers to locally led development. So from this, Humentum developed a policy brief that is shared in the chat outlining the steps the global development sector must take. And this year, Humentum is continuing the conversation in the series by honing in on the steps that organizations are already taking to shift power by shifting their own operations. So just to note, flexible funding, it's sort of an evolving term of art, but I think it means generally core operating and not specific programmatic support. And again, to underscore what Jenna noted, we know that locally led development requires full, fair, and flexible funding for local and national civil society organizations. However, despite the many years we've been talking about this, there seems to continue to be a limited number of real examples of flexible funding in action at scale. So today, I'm delighted to facilitate this conversation with this amazing panel of experts who will offer their own experiences with flexible funding. So before turning to our panel, I've been asked to share a few framing reflections on the current state of the discussion around localization. I'm not going to get into all of the challenges in the world today, but specifically pertaining to this discussion, that conversation, obviously a key component of that conversation is figuring out how to actually operationalize the idea of more flexible funding. And then I'll close with a few questions to get our panel started. So I imagine that most of us here understand the imperative for better resourcing of civil society and communities on the front lines of social issues. I was actually reflecting in preparation for this discussion today, and I pulled out my copy of A Time to Listen, hearing people on the receiving end of international aid, for which I wrote the Kosovo case study 17 years ago. Many of you are likely familiar with this seminal work from Mary Anderson, a wonderful group of colleagues, Mary Anderson, Dana Brown, and Isabella Jean, who at that time were at Collaborative for Development Action. This book was published in 2012. And of course, there are many who have been saying these things to the international community, flexible funding that isn't for time-bound projects, but rather our organization's strategic vision. Don't treat local organizations like contractors and siphon off all of our best human resources. Please don't make us jump through your endless application hoops. Many of these messages are likely familiar and remain exactly the same. And, I wanted to share that we've been talking about these things for a long time. And I think it's important to name that there is frustration on all sides, because I feel it from donors and doers also, partners alike. I think also we know a lot about what needs to be done. We have a lot of really valuable information about where we need to head, and we have experienced moments of possibility. So it seemed for a bit that the pandemic could be a game changer, or at least a catalyst, showing us that it is possible to make decisions about resources much more quickly and with a lot less bureaucracy. But now, in September of 2023, we seem to have backtracked to the status quo. So I think the question before us is, how do we capitalize on the decades of knowledge that we have about these issues and move these transformational funding practices beyond a global moment of catastrophe? We all know there is no shortage of impactful, groundbreaking work to create resilient societies happening in countries and communities all over the world. At least in the discourse amongst donors in the US, what I see is that there seems to be a focus on moving more money to Global South organizations to support these efforts, which of course is absolutely essential. I'm sure most of us are familiar with the Development Initiatives report, noting that in 2022, just 1.2% of public funding to humanitarian efforts went directly to national or local organizations. Obviously, that is shocking and completely unacceptable. So we definitely need to move more of those funds. But at the same time, as we're working to improve that statistic, we also really need to take up the moral imperative of creating a more equitable global system that is aligned with this century's values and realities, which of course is also practical because we know those on the front lines of social issues understand best how to solve them. For those who haven't seen it, and I had shared this link with Jenna. I'm not sure if you guys can drop it in the chat, but Jonathan Clenny and Hassan Damlouji of Global Nation recently argued very articulately about the need to focus not only on the transactional piece of moving more money, which is still a struggle for most donors. And so we want to talk about the operational practices that enable this, which is in part why we're here today. But we also have to talk about the fundamental need to shift power, and that means decision-making to local communities. Who gets to decide how additional resources are being spent? You know, who has the power to make people fill out forms and check certain boxes? I wanted to frame this discussion by suggesting that we have to hold both of these processes. The operational imperative of moving more money more flexibly to community leaders and community-led development, and work that will ultimately change the current international development industrial complex, moving both money and decision-making. So, you know, this includes creating new funding mechanisms that leverage the engagement of a broader range of donors or investors that are not necessarily as intrinsically tied to many of the ineffective practices that we're aware of. And also exploring, of course, I will argue for this, more sustainable resourcing, including but beyond grants. That requires funding for innovation and research and development, which is currently sorely lacking in our sector. As my fellow panelist, Juan Lozano, I keep repeating this, I love this, recently said, given the state of the world, we need to have 2 + 2 become 8 and not 4. And that will only happen through more collaborative work and through innovation. So in service of this discussion, I have 3 questions that I'd like our panelists to focus on in their introductory 3 to 4 minute framing remarks. The first is, how have you provided more flexible funding or accessed more flexible funding, depending on where you sit? And please define for us what flexible means in your work and be as operationally specific as you can be, because I know that there are many legal and procurement officers who may be tuning in or watch this recording who are committed to this mission and truly wondering how to get this done in their system. So no detail is too minute. The second question is, how have these more flexible resources created impact in the work you're doing? And the third question is a big question. How can we get unstuck and move forward more rapidly as a global community on shifting power? And just one more quick note to that question, I would like to add a question for our audience to reflect on. I was at a meeting last week hosted by the Gates Foundation in Seattle of a wonderful group of people in the Strengthening Local Humanitarian Leadership Philanthropic Collaborative. And there, we reflected on how easy it seems to be to deflect around this issue. It's our parliament, it's Congress, they force us to report in certain ways, or always the procurement officers get blamed for everything, or our board of directors, unwilling to take risks. But I firmly believe that we each have individual power to create change within our own sphere of influence. So I'd like to ask each of you to think about and share in the chat, if you'd like, what you are able to change concretely in your own sphere of influence. It could be hosting a dialogue about flexible funding, or reaching out to a colleague in another organization or agency to learn more about how they've enabled shifting power to community leaders or been better partners to local organizations. Really, the smallest to the biggest actions count. And please feel free to share them with us. So with that, I am going to turn to our panel. As they know, I'm going to give them a 30-second warning with the unicorn of hope. So I'm going to ask them to briefly share 3 to 4 minutes of reflections on the questions that I posed. And we will start with Razak Abdirahman, who is a program manager for Co-Impact. Razak, please tell us about Co-Impact and your work on flexible funding.
Thank you, Riva, and thank you for hosting this space. I know it's very, very necessary to continue having these conversations no matter what and actually do a lot of good things with it. So I work at Co-Impact. I'm a program manager. And I work on a specific fund called the Gender Fund. The Gender Fund is essentially a bid for us to raise and deploy US 1 billion over the next decade to really support predominantly women-led global South-oriented organizations with large, unrestricted, long-term and flexible funding. So those three words is what I'm really going to focus on here: unrestricted, long-term, and flexible. And I'm just going to jump not necessarily to what our impact ideally is, but just get right into the operational and what that means. So we work on increasing collaborative funding on large scale for impact. That really means our focus is on program making to support some of the systems change initiatives we focus on. We work in the Global South. We work across three major regions. Literally, Africa, it would be one major region. And we have regionally centered program officers and program managers like myself who have the cultural context, the lived experience, and the operational hindsight to sort of make the connections and the networks needed to make collaborative funding feasible, sustainable, and long-term for our partners. The thing that's important about this is how we relate to flexible funding and unrestricted. Operationally, that means we sort of reduce reporting requirements right away. For us, I think that's 1 year is the requirement, as in if you are working with Co-Impact as a program partner, we don't call for language reasons, we do not call partners grantees or anything like that, or investments. These are program partners we work with. And so with our program partners, we've reduced reporting requirements. We also have something, sort of our secret sauce, as I like to call it, called the design phase grant. And that essentially is when you're engaging with a program partner as Co-Impact, they are given essentially a beginning or operational organizational grant to just spend the first year strategizing on how they would use a multi-year grant. At some time called a planning phase at different orgs, but essentially they got to think about what does that look like strategically? Who are the stakeholders? How are you involved in the community? Who are the organizers? What is what I call the counterfactual? If the funding doesn't go towards your org, who is another organization that's best placed to do this work, right? And so that design phase is 1 year of engagement and planning, working with country advisors, a lot of different types of folks in the fields to really just think about the basics, the operational needs, the HR staffing needs, how you plan to sort of ramp up if needed towards the larger fund that likely is in conversation. So that means we end up doing a 1 year where you're just planning, and then you get a multi-year grant. And that's where the flexible funding bit comes in. Obviously, you can't predict things like climate change issues coming up, say a flood, or even global pandemics that we're still in. So that is where our flexible is. It's really about how do you allow a partner to work within an initiative, work with stakeholders, and also have that flexibility. For us, we do not cap at a percentage of how much it should go to a particular initiative or program. The goal is, depending on how that proposal came in and what you are going to focus on, as long as it is focused on those 3 or 4 or 5 areas, usually ends up being 2 to 3, that's the flexibility you're given. It's around your programs. If that means something needs to shift due to political issues, systems change does require a bit of sometimes called lobbying, sometimes called direct engagement with partners or grassroots organizing, whatever that takes, that is a type of focus and flexibility that our partners have asked for. One thing we're good about and proud about as well at Co-Impact is continually making sure that we are learning from our partners. So we have measurement partners like CEP, the Center for Effective Philanthropy, that we continually work with and survey our partners. So every year, we're going through this right now, we review our grant-making process, our sourcing process, our ongoing support process, and we sort of go through that process. I think where we sort of struggle, and we can get into that more, is how do you shift that power continuously to women-led orgs and Black and Brown-led orgs that have not had historically the type of funding they've needed to continue making system change possible. I'll pause there. I saw that unicorn. It works well.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Razak. And just a quick clarification question. Are the funds that you mentioned guaranteed, the follow-on funds that you mentioned guaranteed from a planning grant?
No, they are not. I think 90% of our partners that we engage with who go through the design phase end up getting follow-on funding that's multi-year, usually 3 to 7 years, depending on the amount and the scale of the problem they're trying to solve. But those are not guaranteed. What ends up happening most of the time, worst case scenario, which I've only experienced happen once, is the partner ends up using a $300,000 to $500,000 design grant for a year to just maybe solidify their theory of change. And then we usually end up revisiting anyway to see if we can continue the engagement and follow on funding after a year. We usually just sort of take a break and then revisit.
Got it. Okay, thank you so much. So next, we will turn to Wendell Azed, who is the founder and executive director of Dandelion Africa. Wendell, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Riva, for this opportunity. So Dandelion Africa is a grassroots innovator that works in the arid and semi-arid regions of Kenya. And we use an integrated approach to, of health, livelihood, youth, and advocacy to improve the health and economic outcomes of our communities. To your question, Riva, as you've heard the word integrated, and that word integrated usually sends chills down most partners' backs because it comes with a lot of complexity. For us at Dandelion, because we work with women and girls in really hardship areas, we understand first and foremost that their needs are very complicated. We can't solve the issue of healthcare or sexual reproductive health and say that we have impacted them. We need a multi-dimensional approach towards these issues for us to be able to see real impact at the community level. So for us, what does flexibility or flexible funding mean? It means everything. It means freedom, because we are right here in the community. I'm sitting in a small village in Mogotio. Women receive contraceptives door to door through the backpack nurse model. The same women are trained on economic empowerment to save and borrow their own money, because here our culture does not allow women, in some cases, to own property so they don't have collateral. It is the same women whose children we train on agency to be able to advocate for themselves and end female genital mutilation. And we teach the whole community, engaging men and boys, to champion and advocate for resources within the community. We would not be able to actually articulate what we are doing and do it well if we did not have flexible funding, because it has allowed us to innovate. For example, last year or the year before, in our strategic plan, we started dreaming about building a hospital near the Amboseli National Park. So women from there walk sometimes 20 or so kilometers to the nearest facility, and unskilled deliveries there are up to 78%. But it was a dream that we could not get money to build this container hospital that we were crazy about, because we knew for a fact that that would reduce the traditional birth attendants getting HIV. It would improve girls' transition in schools, because we would start the Girls for Leaders program there. It would improve women's livelihood, because they would have the one thing most women around the world don't have, and that is time. So flexible funding has allowed us to actually see real impact at the community level. It has allowed Dandelion to innovate. It has allowed me as a leader and a founder of the organization to build a very strong team, because I don't have to worry about getting the best team for the job. Most importantly, it has allowed the community to trust us, because we are here, we listen, we understand what they're going through, we listen to the solutions that they're coming up with, and we have the resources to implement the projects. And in Dandelion, we have what we call a community board. So the community board is like our, well, I'm going to use the word dipstick for lack of a better word. So they check at the community level if the things that they said they wanted is actually happening. And we would not be able to do any of these things if we didn't have flexible funding. How do we get unstuck and move forward more rapidly as a global community on shifting power? I think from my perspective as an implementer, I think having more spaces like this for some of us to talk about how impactful flexible funding has been, to talk about the challenges of flexible funding as well, because I think that sometimes we focus so much on, yes, we want flexible funding. But as a founder, when I started Dandelion, I didn't come in as a person who had skills to run an NGO. I don't know how it works with philanthropies. I don't know if you guys go to school and then you go, like, you get a degree in philanthropy, then you start your foundation. Or like me, you start from a point of passion. You start from a point of pain and you want to solve something in your community because it's affecting you and your people directly. So you learn as you go, but with unrestricted grants, with flexibility of funding, you want to be able to tell the partner openly, communicate openly and say, by the way, I don't know how to manage my finances. I don't know about HR, and flexible funding can help me build a more sustainable organization. Thank you so much, Riva.
Wonderful. Thank you, Wendo. And there are a number of things, building trust and things that are impactful, but not as easy to measure, that I think we will go back to. But moving along, I'm going to turn it over to Juan Lozano, who is the founder and CEO of Innpactia. Juan, please.
Thank you, Riva, and thank you very much to everybody who's been part of organizing this very, very interesting conversation and space. So from our side, what we've done is we've created a platform that facilitates the design of new vehicles, financial vehicles, to channel funding and financing to those actors that are making impact possible in Latin America mainly. So a lot of our concentration is creating new ways through which it is easy to flexibilize or make more flexible the funding and how that is implemented, and making sure that it arrives to the right places at the right time. And a big component of what we have been incorporating in all the different processes of the technology that we've been implementing is user friendliness. It cannot continue to be as difficult as horrible to be part of funds, to engage to donors, to engage to impactful projects. So we're doing this mainly with funders, or let's say in three different types of users: funders and investors on one side, organizations and entrepreneurs on the second side, and consultants or experts on the third side. And by including a lot of more user friendliness in the processes, we by default are making the processes altogether much more inclusive. In a way, we say we need to make help ecosystem actors find the best version of themselves. And a couple of very concrete and operational examples of how we do this. So, for example, if we're helping out the design of a new fund, yes, we're encouraging that those funds are designed in the countries where they will be implemented, because that, generates the possibility for the needs to be better covered. We provide data to the design process, data that is extracted, let's say, reflected from the behavior of over 60,000 entrepreneur and NGO users of the platform, where they manifest their needs. So we use that data to provide it to the design process of the funds, so that the funds are better reflective of what the needs of those communities or those impact actors are. 3, we're encouraging funding to never come on its own, but to always be coming in hand with non-financial support, with capacity building, with technical expertise that de-risks the activities as well. And 3, we're also bringing regenerative behaviors to the processes. So just a very easy example: in all of our processes, all the calls within Innpactia, we're asking the donors, what are you going to give in exchange to all the applicants? So by default, those applicants that dedicate time to things will receive automatically through the platform either a capacity building cycle or a keynote speaker conference, or we're starting with very simple things, but we want this to move on forward, just to make sure that everybody's giving and bringing back. And last but not least, how have more of these flexible resources created impact? So one key example, is something we actually built together, where we met with Riva and Latinpacto, another organization in the Americas, where in Barranquilla we were able to co-design between grassroots organizations and philanthropic organizations what would the ideal fund look like, in terms of the reporting, in terms of the types of financial support that was being provided. And this was a very interesting conversation to get in the end to very concrete, a concrete fund that is right now starting operations. Another example, and I'll close with this: greenpreneurs, rural farmers that are getting technical assistance, and they're actually using WhatsApp as the main channel of communication with the Innpactia platform, so that we're talking in their language, in their channels where they are used to talk to, and we're getting both the funding but also the technical expertise to them. So thank you so much. I hope I was clear enough with some examples to have actually a conversation or more ideas out there. And thanks for the invitation.
Great. Thank you so much, Juan. And Wendell, in a minute, I want to go back to both of you. I'm just going to give you a heads up. And I want to ask you to reflect on the journey of being founders. I think it's something that we should talk about honestly, because it's easy to be here today and talk about our vision and the successes and how we're operationalizing flexible funding. But I'd like to go back to both of you to ask how did you get there? But first, I want to turn to Brian Sims, who is the Director of Peace Building Partnerships at Humanity United. I know there's a lot of exciting things happening at Humanity United these days, launching a new strategy. So, Brian, please tell us more about your work.
Sure, it's great to be here, and thanks to everyone. Let me kick off by maybe saying briefly what it is that led to our flexible approach and toolbox. And really something that drives our strategy, our grant-making process or practice, our accompaniment approach is an acknowledgement that people give up power when they think they don't have it. And we all know what this looks like. We see it every day, whether you are in Uganda or Myanmar or in the United States or here in Denmark, where I am at the moment. And that is when people give up their power, it manifests as fear, as distrust, as polarization, or a lack of participation in your community or in elections, and so on and so forth. And so for Humanity United, flexible funding is really about how we cede power and decision-making to those who are most proximate to today's challenges around freedom or peace or security. How we do that, there's a few things. I think fundamentally what we were trying to do within HU is actually build a new practice that includes our partners directly and co-developing or co-designing our strategies. I think it's something really important in that it provides an opportunity for partners to interrogate opportunities, challenges where they perhaps see leverage. I think it provides another opportunity for us to think about or refine our grant-making practices and the services that we can provide to make sure that they're effective for folks and also keep them safe. And it's another way to actually hold us as an institution accountable to the people that we're really in service of. Operation, there's a few things that we do. So we make sure that we have the ability to provide what we call general operations support, so also unrestricted funding, as well as really flexible project support. Partners have the ability to essentially tell us in cases of project support how long that project should be, how many months it should be. Super flexible in terms of making sure that they have the type of resources they need to do what they need to do. We just started offering multi-year grants. We've also provide sponsorship to make sure partners can host convenings, pull people together to talk about challenges, find ways to collectively respond together when it comes to some of those challenges. We're very flexible in terms of how we amend goals and objectives of projects. recognizing that things in countries that are often steeped in violence and authoritarianism, things change really quickly and people have to be able to adapt. Something else we've started to do is we seek out fiscal sponsorships for more informal networks. So networks who are not able to register or who choose not to register because there's some strength in their ability to stay informal, as well as support for nonviolent social movements. And we've also started to exercise our ability to basically contract out some of the work, particularly for work that is too risky for partners in hard places to do the work. So for example, we're able to do things like contract researchers who can explore what illicit economies look like and how they drive violence in certain places, and then ensure that our partners are part of that design process, that information goes back to them, or it's translated in a way that's easily accessible and they can actually use it, but would be too difficult for those partners to actually do in country for obvious reasons that are often very risky and could threaten their own lives. And lastly, what we do is we make sure that when it comes to proposals or reporting, we are doing that with them. So we try to make sure that we can be that translator between them and the institution. When it comes to reporting, we actually try to hold conversations maybe once a quarter just to get a sense of what's happening within a particular space, but also for us to share back with partners what we're seeing, what we're hearing, and how we can be in better service of them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. And just a quick clarification for you. You noted that you guys just started to give multi-year support.
That's
Can
correct.
you just, and by multi-year support, what does that mean? What does that look like?
Sure. So for both general operating support and for project grants, we're able to offer support that now can be 2 to 3 years long, as opposed to what we used to be able to do was essentially guarantee a year or less if that was something that was desired. And so that's new for us, and we're really excited about it.
Gotcha. Great. Okay, thank you so much. So I think we have about 40 minutes to take any questions. And I'm going to pose a couple of questions to our panel. But for those of you in the audience, please put your questions, anything that you'd like to discuss in the chat, and we will take them up. But I'd like to first go back to that question that I posed to Juan and Wendo. Again, I think part of the purpose of today's discussion is to really get into the how. So it's easy, or not easy. We all we all are making an effort to be here, but I don't want to just hold up these examples of things that are working really well and not interrogate and understand better how you guys created an environment where you were able to actually access those resources. So, and again, and I'm hoping we can have an honest conversation about this. As a fellow founder, I know it's a struggle to start and run a new organization. So, Wendo, I'd love to turn to you and just hear a little bit, as I said, about your journey. What did you start right out of the gate with the kinds of flexible resources that you described that that support your strategy? Did you spend a couple of years, we've all been there, building relationships with donors before they really supported your vision and supported the trust building? Juan and I heard a lot about this in a meeting we were in Barranquilla earlier this year, that grantees or partners, community-based organizations want resources for relationship and trust building, and not obviously programmatic activities, these things that are absolutely enable them to do their work, but are hard to put in a project or a grant application. So Wendo, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Riva, for this very interesting question. My journey as a founder was very, very strange. I didn't have any experience in running a nonprofit. I started from a point of wanting to do something with the knowledge that I had. I used all my resources, my family resources, chasing a dream that I was not sure was even going to work. All I knew was that it filled my soul with something. And I saw women who were living with HIV, kids who were living with HIV at that time, this is like a decade ago, improving, and lives were changing, and I knew I was on the right path. I didn't know what a strategic plan was. As I said earlier, as a founder, for me, I didn't know anything. A friend of mine actually introduced me to our very first funder, Pangea Giving, who are based in Seattle. And Pangea Giving, when they came to my office, the first time I had a very small office, I was paying like $20 a month. I just had a desk. If you open the door, you hit the desk, you know, it was so small. And that at that time, I think I thought to myself, if I was him, I would not give me money, because to be honest, there was nothing there except this crazy woman with these ideas. But they took a chance on Dandelion and they introduced us to Seagull Family Foundation, and our life changed. So we did not come into flexible funding immediately. It took almost 3 years of no funding, of building up structures, of learning about how do nonprofits work, of putting up documents. To be honest, Riva, I was so scared of funders because of the myths and misconceptions that I had. I saw from people within that community, grantee community, of how scared they were every time a donor was coming to visit. There was cleaning of windows, there was filing, there was, you know, it's like, I can't explain to you the first time, even for me, when I had a site visit, I did not sleep, I could not eat. I was like, I'm expecting some form of deity to come and save me. But flexible funding and both restrictive and unrestricted funding started coming in around the 3rd to 4th year since I started Dandelion. And at that time, I began to understand the importance of paperwork, the importance of data, because I needed to show that by doing A, B, C, D, I was going to get to Z, and 2 + 2 was 8. But how do I get there? I needed to show very clearly to any funder, to any potential person who came, that Dandelion was actually making impact, for example, in education, that we were having better transition in schools because of the Girls for Leaders, Boys for Change program. But I think maybe just to finish, one of the things that flexible funding helped was also opening other doors for flexible funding. Because if it were not for Seagull opening that door for us, then people would not trust us. They wouldn't trust us. And I would go to them because they showed that they trusted Dandelion. I trusted them, because I think people think that it is trust-based philanthropy. You trust us, but we also need to trust you. I need to be open to communicate that there are things I don't know. There are things that we need capacity. There are things that we need strengthening, without fear of someone saying, we'll take away the money from you because you don't have capacity. There is no African organization that doesn't have capacity, because we live in this continent. The people who work and trust me in this community know that I have gone through the things that they have gone through. And that is the reason why, for me, starting Dandelion Africa was about trust from the beginning. Trust from the community, because I needed them to trust me, because we have gone through the same thing: lack of reproductive health, gender-based violence, effects of HIV. We've gone through all these things together. They know my journey, I know their journey. Now, the second part was trusting myself in this journey. Understanding that I did not know, and being very open and candid to my partners and saying, by the way, I don't know what this theory of change is, as Razak was saying. I don't know what this theory of change, and who are these people who come up with these terminologies? Don't you know we're in like a small village somewhere in Mogotio? Kindly simplify. Yeah, so things like that. And lastly, being trusted by our partners, because they know that when they come to Wendo and when they come to Dandelion Africa, I will be candid and I will be open with them about what I know, what I don't know. And lastly, I will use my voice to champion for other local organizations, even when it means, especially in our area, even when it means losing funding, because not everyone is for localization. Yeah, sometimes we are looked at as, you're the villain, you're the guys who want flexible funding. So yeah, you guys just look for flexible funding. We are funding restrictive funding. And the more you speak about it, not everybody will be happy. So putting yourself in the line and making sure that the path that we are leaving behind as grassroots organization is not just talking, but we are sharing this space. We are bringing and introducing other organizations into these spaces, so that we stop having this starvation mentality, where we are worried that if I introduce another organization to co-impact, I will get less funding. And that's a problem with local organizations, that the more voices are out there, we can show them that I am capable of mentoring other organizations like Dandelion. I can introduce them to River. I can introduce them to co-impact, and they can do incredible job. I think we'll be able to minimize poverty in our continent faster when we work together. Thank you, River.
Thank you so much, Wendo. There's so much rich information in your answer, and really appreciate you being candid that it took 3 to 4 years, right? I mean, these things don't just happen overnight. And I just want to pick out, before turning to Juan, your point in particular about, which I think is actually related to what Brian said about people giving up power. So I think one thing that we all can do, to the question that I posed to us, is make one introduction a week. We can each, that's an easy target, right? I think, Wendell, I so appreciate your point that, and how Pangea facilitated your journey by introducing you to SEGO Foundation. So a message to donors, that is huge, and that is within your power to do. And I frankly don't see that enough. So I think that's something really important to note among many things that you said. Juan, can we hear a little bit about your journey as a founder and the realities of getting to more flexible resources?
Oh, here we go. Thank you. Yes. It is a very interesting question, and I'm going to be as candid as I can also, because I usually, as a founder, you're not expected to be as candid. You're expected to be the strong figure that is unbreakable and and that has no vulnerability whatsoever, right? So a little bit of about this. Innpactia is the second organization, the second entrepreneurial activity I had, and actually Innpactia was born out of an initial social enterprise that I built that works on impact measurement, and the truth is that the first thing I can tell you is to your question, being a founder is really not a rational decision. If you look at it rationally and you look at all the things that you're going to have to face and all the, and then you having a family and want to give, all the things that they need and it's not a rational decision. And I'll let some comments regarding that later on, because I think that the very key to a founder is taking care of oneself, and taking care of oneself has to do with mental health. And I'll leave some things for the chat box to comment on that. But also, it's the why that is the savior. Why are you doing this? Who said that we need to take rational decisions all the time? And why we're founders, because we found things that are very important to us, that make sense, that are very connected to purpose and to why we what makes us happy in terms of how we engage with the world. And in our case, it had to do a lot with the inequalities in the relationships. I had been working as in the donor side for many years. I was the manager of a country program of an international development aid government in Colombia. So of course, there's a lot of motivations being Colombian. We have a lot of relationship with extreme poverty. We've been exposed to that. We've been exposed to conflict, like armed conflict and tragedies and violence and so many awful things. So there is a thing in, I would say, a lot of Colombians to do something. I used to often say, this is the world we were sent to fix. So it kind of as a way to say, there's so many things we can complain about, but there's a mission here and we need to get on to it. Getting back a little bit to Innpactia, the early years, we were able to, from the first social enterprise, to take some money of our own to start the project of Innpactia. But what really made it grow was the additional support. One of them was a close friend of mine from school who worked in New York in a bank and stuff, and he said, I believe in you. I'm not too sure what your, the technicalities of what you want to do, but I believe in you, and I want to, invest in this idea and join you and help you however we want. Another key supporter in those early years was the Ford Foundation. That flexibilized the way they usually look at things, and they said, well, yes, this is a social enterprise, it's not an NGO, but why not? It's an ecosystem builder building project, and they found the way around it as well. And then we also have been quite supported by family offices that are engaged or are interested into philanthropy, but they said, well, again, why not? Why not supporting this idea? So I wouldn't definitely be here without their initial support. Now, the key to the early supporters, I think, is the reciprocity to them, and to making sure that, firstly, and I very much valued your comment, Wendo, the transparency. It's not only asking for transparency from donors and investors and all of these other communities. You need to start, you need to lead by example, So I often think of new donors or supporters or investors as the opportunity to start changing things very immediately, changing the ecosystem with that initial engagement. And that initiates by also, being very clear in terms of what you're thinking about things and where you don't agree with things, even if you're afraid that might end up, not making them lose interest on you and things. But in the end, we are teaching each other how to relearn things and unlearn some other things. And I think people or organizations who receive funding are the first teachers and professors to the funders themselves. We are in a process where they want to learn also from, what's going on our perspective. So I apologize for the disorganized answer to your very, very complex question, but I think that in terms of us, the transparency and just being very aligned to the purpose of why we started this project. Why we started this project, because we want to make connections. We want to make connections be better. We're not happy only with the funding arriving to the NGOs. We're interested in how that funding arrives, and struggling for that is tough, and changing things is tough. But that is why also, we're doing what we're doing. So it's worthwhile the effort.
Thank you so much, Juan, and trust me to ask a very complicated question. So thank you to both you and Wendo for your really honest answers. And just to highlight a couple of things that I heard that I think you both spoke to were the idea of resilience, right? I mean, what we all say about how, those who have lived experience in these communities understand the issues. And as Wendo said, this have capacity. We have to stop using that term, but Juan, you spoke to that too, just the resilience that has led to perhaps innovation and creativity, right? So, and I think that relates to a second thing that I heard both of you say, which is, again, this really believing in a person, which this whole current kind of grant making cycle dissuades us, is still focused on projects, right? We have to propose a project. It's hard to present yourself as a person with an idea, which of course is what a founder is. So, and the honesty that's required, and the humility to say, I don't know what your log frame is and why you're asking me this. So thank you for those really honest answers. I want to turn to a couple of questions, and thank you so much for what you all have shared in the chat. I'm going to turn to a couple of questions from the chat, and to Razak and Brian, to our funders with us. So Susan has asked the question whether anyone has been able to convince a funder to move from restricted to flexible funding. This is to all of you, actually. But I'm particularly interested in the dynamic of how you both influence your peers. So I think there's a perception that donors listen to donors. And so particularly, to Susan's question, how have you influenced others to adopt more flexible funding practices? Razak, let's start with you.
Thank you. So this is somewhat of a work in progress for us. I'll lead with that because I think we're at the phase where we are sort of doing these multi-year grants. Just for some context, we're 5 years old. We were fiscally sponsored for the first 4 years. And so we're in this stage where part of my job, to be honest, is working in sort of 3 areas, strategic development, implementation, knowledge management, and then the last thing is really cross-team support. And that builds out into a bunch of things. Part of that is building out really our outcomes, our reporting strategy and structures, our technical assistance and management assistance spaces, because there are a lot of non-money oriented supports that we do offer to our partners through the process of the design phase and then the ongoing multi-year funding. With all that being said, I think our biggest challenge really has been, how do you bring in these larger funding partners that we also focus with? So going back to the Gender Fund, we launched it with some of the biggest names in the world: Gates Foundation, Mackenzie Scott. And a lot of these folks are involved in giving to us, but also helping us guide the strategy to sort of make these unrestricted, long-term flexible funding operationalized, really, like that strategy operationalized. So that challenge has been tough. One thing we've worked on recently that came out with Bridgespan is, and I've shared this, is around philanthropic collaborative landscape in general. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to influence the field to show that, one, collaborative funding works, and it works at a high rate because part of what I shared earlier is about how we work on systems change. The way we work on it really is centered on gender equity long-term. We work across 3 major sectors: education, health, and economic opportunity. But then we also work across domains, as we call it. And I shared an example of HIRE, an organization, a women-led advocacy group of lawyers, jurists, all types of people in Mexico who've really notched a big win that we call systems change, right? Like now in Mexico, there is an increased access to a women's right to choose, simply put, due to the advocacy that they've done and the grant making that we've done over the last 2 years. So with that is an example of, look, hey, here's an example of work that has worked. This is an example of an outcome that has created systemic change for 50% of a population that has been historically marginalized across the planet and in Mexico, of course. So that's an example of the type of influence we're trying to push through media, through these types of reputable sources of information and access to show that, look, these collaboratives work. If you look through that, and I'll end with this, Brian, so I can share, so you can have time to share. But if you look through that that Bridgespan document, 2 things are going to stick out. 1/3 of the funding collaboratives in that sample size of 200, they report the primary issue area is either gender equity or racial and ethnic justice. That's unique. But also, if you break that data down, you notice that that's the spaces that the larger funders aren't really too focused on. Equity and justice orientations were less well represented among the larger funds, as in the larger funds defined as orgs that can give upwards of 25 million or up per year. This really suggests that there are steep barriers to funding for organizations that focus on gender equity and racial justice, right? So that is this world we're in, where we are trying to fundraise and do this bit and bring along these larger funders who are focused on sometimes more narrow issue areas than something as wide and, to be frank, as hard to measure outcomes as gender equity and justice.
Thank you so much, Razak. I think you're speaking to another critical shift, maybe thinking about, believing in people and founders and not projects, this shift to things that are cross-cutting and intersectional, and really moving away from, how we've siloed different areas. Of course, that we know all these things, but how to get there, we will look forward to reading your Bridgespan report. And it sounds like you guys are doing great work around this. Brian, if I could I think this question is particularly appropriate, relevant for you as well. In addition to how you influence your peers, another question from our audience is whether any of the panelists have experience with funding from collective action coalitions with multiple actors, and how, if so, how are those awards structured? And I know you've done a lot of work on movements, and that, and if you could speak to that, that would be great.
Sure. Let me quickly hit the first question, and I'll speak a bit more at length at the second. I think when it comes to trying to influence peers, I think I spend personally a lot of time in conversation. And a lot of that conversation is really trying to sort of drive home a few points. One is that a lot of the challenges that we are all grappling with are intersectional and transnational in nature. That's one. And it's sort of a recognition that no matter how many resources we have, we are not going to be able to solve a problem unless we try to solve it collectively. And I think that's something that is gaining traction in a lot of the sort of philanthropic spaces that I'm in, at least. And so I think there's a lot of momentum around this. And maybe just sort of two quick things around things that are taking place now around this. So the Human Rights Funders Network is leading a new initiative around building resilience in places that are experiencing political, economic, or humanitarian crises. So for those of you who are on this call who are part of that network, I would certainly encourage you to reach out to Kalia, but also tune into some of the invitations that have been going out. The idea behind that is to end up in a place in about 9 months where we can have some conversations as donors around what are our challenges operationally or culturally, what are the things that we can offer, and how can we actually do so together so we can essentially leverage our strengths as institutions collectively to actually show up for people in these contexts. And then the other, and this will sort of segue into the piece around support from movements, is we have been a part of a very small collective that has been working with USAID on their 5-year, $45 million Powered by the People initiative, which is essentially the US government response to rising authoritarianism. It is purposely broad, but within that, it is trying to figure out ways the US government can best support collective action, whether it's movements or coalitions, or creating more enabling environments for those movements and coalitions to do their work. Also, a little tricky for governments to be supporting that. However, what HU has done, and we're in conversation with a few other philanthropic organizations, is we are intending to set up a multi-donor fund to basically supplement that USAID initiative. The idea is making sure that goals and objectives of movements and coalitions aren't captured or influenced by different administrations' policies or just policies in general. It's to make sure that we can be more responsive for folks who are often steeped in really difficult experiences or on the front lines of taking on challenges head on. But also it is to find ways to connect organizations and individuals that are across sectors, across levels, and in some cases across different geographies who are grappling with very similar issues to find opportunities to develop shared understandings of problems, to find opportunities to identify potential areas of leverage where they can work together to try to address that challenge, but also to share learning and experiences that can ideally move folks to being away from only being reactive to how governments or states or autocrats are responding, and being more proactive and ahead of the game. Specifically, some of the things that we do is we work through fiscal sponsors who are identified by either activists or organizations that are a part of movements to make sure that it creates a little bit of a buffer between ourselves as an institution and the work that they're doing, but also it gives them a little more flexibility in terms of how they're able to do their work. And it also essentially reduces their risk in terms of being possibly perceived as recipients of money or as foreign agents. And I think that's something that perhaps a lot of us are also dealing with. So it creates a little bit of a deniability for partners who are in those risky positions. And where we really spend a lot of our own time in trying to We recognize that not everyone can do everything. So we work really intensely and really intentionally with partners, particularly within social movements, to get an understanding of what some of those gaps might be that are potentially prohibiting a movement from dealing with sort of conflict that erupts naturally and internally, or connecting to new constituencies. And us as an institution working with them to identify partners who are perhaps outside of a movement or are in other countries that perhaps can sort of create a more enabling environment for them to do their work.
Great, Brian, thank you so much. And if we have time, I may come back to asking you a little bit more about how you developed that partnership with USAID. An issue that has come up a lot in the conversations I've been having is more collaboration across bilateral donors and private foundations, and really the how of given that the regulations and structures are very different, how that can actually happen. But first, Juan, I see your hand, and then I want to respond to Healy's comment in the chat. Juan.
So you asked if there is any other experiences in terms of the collective action part. So yes, and I would say, I would start by saying which are the challenges that we've mostly faced and had to, sort out. And I think that it's mainly three when it comes to collective action initiatives, particularly when that collective action comes from the sources of funding and financing. And the first one has to do with the very different procurement procedures and rules and the unflexibility that comes from them. This is an area where we're seeing a lot of improvement, or let's say efforts being done from the philanthropy. I have to say also from impact investing funds and initiatives, but not enough from international financial institutions or traditional governmental donors. We believe, a bit of my analysis there is that there's not enough incentives internally, for a civil servant to kind of like try to take a bike and go uphill instead of ticking off the boxes and performing well through easier ways. So we need incentives there for those things to change. To the different timings, I think it's very different, very, very difficult when you're trying collective action to be put into place to get the right timing of when this first donor or organization wants to fund, and then to get everybody aligned at the same time in the same moment. That is very, very different. And finally, I have to say the power games that are out there. And by power games, I mean there's always a stronger donor that wants the rest of the donors to work on their times, on their forms, and on their around their priorities. So a bit of what we've been doing is we created a lot of what Innpactia has been doing these last 2 years around the idea of fiscal sponsorships and flexible fiscal sponsorships as well, is to create financial and operational structures for those multi-donor funds or mechanisms to, let's say, be hosted in a neutral place that has been built after studying what a lot of these actors actually need in terms of reporting, in terms of the types of financial instruments used, the protections that they need, et cetera, et cetera. Also, not only for multi-donor, but also for blended finance. That is a little bit even more complex because you're mixing non-refundable financial resources with resources that expect some sort of financial return out of those activities as well. And secondly, a lot of what we've been doing is also, that first point I mentioned is a lot of technology and a lot of product development, very much tailor-made to this situation. The second part is more like the manual reaction of work. Okay, this new donor wants to come in. What do you need? Oh, we need you to actually fill out this form. Okay, we'll fill out those forms and see, So it does require, these handyman in a way, or, to come in and intermediate, but it's a lot of effort to trying to get everybody to be satisfied without them moving on their procedures.
Thank you. I think that underscores an issue that has come up a lot in our work, that the learning within these systems, and this is, I think, particularly, within government agencies. One, as you said, the incentives aren't necessarily, the incentives are aligned to the status quo, right? So, it's sort of easy just to continue on the treadmill that you're on. And I think, part of the networking that needs to happen, and part of the work that donors, we all need to figure out how to support, is how you actually find those champions within a system and help them with the how of creating these changes. So I was invited to speak to the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs Locally Led Development Working Group, long title, in May, and a very committed group of Dutch MFA officials. And I was walking away. I think it's okay to share this. We were walking out of that group, and one of them said to me, we have so many people like all of you, Wendo and Razak and Brian and Juan and myself, come and talk to us. We are so lucky in that we have these people come and shares their work and their ideas, but then the uptake of it is hard. We walk away from this working group and we have a whole 150% job that takes all of our time. So I think, just to note, and related to what you were saying, Juan, about the incentives and finding those spaces, it has to be intentional. So Brian, I heard some of that also in what you were saying about your partnership with USAID, really, a partnership that enables going into these procurement processes and figuring out how to fund fiscal sponsors and do these more technical things. And we never have enough time to dive into all those technical details in these panels, but I'm sure people can reach out to each of you if they're interested. And those are the technical specificities that people are interested in. So Healy, I just want to quickly speak to your very apt comment about the idea of believing in founders. Of course, I'm biased, being a founder myself, but just wanted to note that 100%. I think the idea is really shifting out of this project-focused mentality. And Wendo, I want to ask you, as we only have 15 minutes left, but I want to ask you a question about that. You don't have to be a founder. I think founders, being a founder, starting an organization is a particular, as Juan said, possibly you have to have a particular craziness to want to do that. But absolutely, there's, community-led, community-based organizations that don't have a particular founder. So I think the idea is really just, and this came up in this, the locally led humanitarian working group last week, believing in a vision, asking organizations or individuals to share a vision versus a project. So Wendo, you had touched on that, and I just wanted to turn to you to share any really concrete, that is definitely not the norm, right? And I think those of us who are used to doing applications also default into proposing projects. So I just wanted to ask you to share a little bit more about, you mentioned the hospital and you had a vision, for something. Have you been successful in putting forward, a strategic plan versus a project? And what has that looked like?
Thank you very much for your question, Riva. I think the strategic plan is the long-term vision of what you foresee the community is going to look like in 3 years, in 5 years. And I think for Dandelion Africa, we have only been successful because we have been mentored. As I said earlier, the word strategic initiatives or strategic planning was, the only thing I knew was how to plan my own finances. So I'll use the example of Seagull for lack of, we have other amazing funders, Partners for Equity, among others, who have taken their time to mentor me first as a founder, and then mentor the leadership of the organization. I think sometimes the question is the putting a lot of effort on the founder and not on the leadership. So just to go back to the question of Heather, I think, when you believe in people and when you believe on the founder, they build and they help create and build great organizations that then create great projects or strategies that are able actually to do the work and work with the community. So either way, whether you're looking at a project, there has to be a contact person who will be talking to someone. And that contact person will not be people, it will be a person. And that is the person who will, whether they are the founders or they are the representative of a group of people, they will have to resonate with the people behind the scene or whoever they are or their partners for them to really believe in the vision that is being sold to them. So for me, I find it easier to sell the vision because I have this craziness around me where I'm thinking, can you imagine if we had a hospital, a 40-foot container hospital in the middle of nowhere? Most people will back off and go like, okay, that's a crazy idea. How are you going to fund it? How are you going to equip it? How are you going to get human resource there? How are you going to sustain it? But I have all these answers if you just trust in the process. But that trust-based philanthropy is not so easy to come by. So when you have incredible funders who not only listen to the vision, not necessarily the project. I will do the project plan, of course, but it is the vision that I'm talking about. Like, can you imagine in 10 years, there will be no unskilled deliveries in Amboseli, for example? I'm selling a vision. I'm working towards a certain goal, and this is how I want to start. I'm not saying that I know how it's going to work out, and I'm very clear about that, but I'm asking you to walk with me through this journey where you will be part of this process because it's not just about the money. It is about you as a funder coming to Amboseli and seeing this woman with 10 children. And then now she has a business when you come after 3 years, and her kids are going to university after 10 years. And you are actually part of this process and working with us. So for me, I feel investing and really believing in the people that are talking to you, not talk about projects because projects are shorter. There's the issue, there's the issue of short-term projects where we found partners sometimes want results in 6 months, in 1 year. And one of the things I learned earlier on from some mentorship sessions I went to with Seagull was that always articulate what is true. Always articulate what is true and what is possible within your own community, because after 6 months, if you want to see impact for a woman who's received contraceptives, I don't know what I will show you. But come back after 3 years, I will show you nursery schools with lesser children and better quality education. I will show you a woman who's built a stone house from a mud hut. I will show you a woman who has a business. I will show you a Dandelion with 3 medical centers. So that is what I can say. You sell the vision, but the vision has to come from somebody, regardless of whether it's the founder or representatives. But we need a space and we need a table to be able to be free enough to say, this is my vision. It's not a project, it's a journey. And I think that is what I'm actually representing here today, to say systems change, and the changes we want to see can only happen when the people with power are able to change themselves. Otherwise, you cannot understand what I'm saying if you're not willing to change either. Thank you so much, Riva.
Thank you, Wendell. I wrote that down. It's not a project, it's a journey. I think, again, you've articulated so many important things. Being honest. I can't show you these results in 6 months, but what I can do is show it to you in 3 years. I think for the donors out there, one thing that's coming to my mind as a concrete suggestion is helping meet the kind of gap between articulating a vision and making it concrete and what you all need to fund something. I feel like oftentimes the feedback that we get on our pitch decks or our proposals is that it's not specific enough, or what piece of this can we fund? But of course, organizations, whether you're in New York City or anywhere in the world, don't always know exactly how to speak to a donor. So I think that's, something concrete that donors, I saw that Siegel was mapping and doing introductions in the chat, which is wonderful. And I think another concrete thing donors can do is remember that organizations don't always know how to frame their message in a way that lands the way donors need to hear it. So walking that journey, that's a piece of walking that journey. Juan, sorry, did you have your hand up? No, okay. We only have a few minutes left, and I'm going to turn to each of you just with a closing question and some comments. But very quickly, Wendell, I want to see if we can just respond to one more question from the chat, which was around the reporting that was requested from, and I'm not sure which specific donor that was, but I think you were speaking about the flexible funding that you've received. And can you just say a word about the types of reporting that funding has entailed?
Thank you. So the beauty of flexible funding also comes with lighter processes. And that gives Dandelion and me and the team more time to focus on the job. So it's basically templates. They might even say we give a 6-month report, but we have our own culture where we give quarterly reports. But it is very simplified to a point where we can ask for Zoom calls or WhatsApp calls, so that we can actually even give more information when we feel, okay, this template is so simple, they might not really understand the depth of this, this impact or this outcome. So for us, it's usually templates, especially for flexible funding. It is lighter processes. It is one-on-one conversations. It is donors coming to Mogotio here, staying with us, understanding, meeting the community, understanding really the impact that we are trying to achieve, and also to hear from the beneficiaries and to hear from the community themselves what this flexible funding has done for the community. So that is what our reporting system looks like, including stories of change, which is very, very impactful, where we document stories of change, and you can see 8 years ago, this woman, and you can see this woman 8 years later, or this child, or this community. And I think that is a way to lighten the reporting processes in a way that grassroots organization, we are storytellers. Let's use story to actually show you the impact that we're making on the ground. And that's the kind of reporting that we usually request and our funders request from us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see our audience member is asking about audits, which I will let you, given that we're running out of time, I will let you follow up offline about that specifically. But I love that. We are storytellers. Another pithy takeaway. So we only have about 5 minutes. So I want to just turn to each of our panelists, and I'll go in the order that you spoke originally. And again, our focus here is on the concrete how. This whole series by Humentum has been really on the how of creating more flexible funding. So in service of operationalizing all of the ideals that we talked about today, what is your one thing, your one call to action? And if you could ask this audience to partner, the one thing you would change, and if you could ask this audience to partner with you, who would be your partner in that change that you're seeking? Razak.
Okay, I'm speaking as Razak at the moment and not necessarily a representative of Co-Impact. So for me, and in what little experience I've had of 7-8 years in this space, I think it's really dealing with larger funders and working with bigger funders who, to Juan's point and Wendell's point, sort of see sometimes a more myopic or parochial vision of how we create systems change in the long term, right? So for me, that's really my target. The way I've sort of been trained or experienced as a program officer when I was more deeply involved in grant making is being an advocate and a translator at the same time. A good example of that is really the design phase, to Wendell's point. we may not relate to the term gender equity in the same way across the world, right? A good example of this is a partner we're working with in Indonesia, where we're looking for these terms in their, RFPs and in their proposals, and we're like, what the heck? What are they talking about, right? And the reality is they use language like, and I'm thinking of a particular partner, they talk about harmony in the house, in the home. And then when you break that down and you ask those questions, you realize you are talking about gender equity. They're just not using Western colonial, history and language tied to that, right? So that's an example of the way I relate to this. It's like engage with funders, but translate that language, and make sure that that activity is what really matters. And those visions, those long-term visions is what's most important. I'll stop there just for time purposes and pass it on.
Wonderful. Wendo, quickly, your one call to action.
Call to action is, if you don't understand what flexibility is all about, visit organizations, come to the ground, talk to us. We will show you what flexibility really means. Look at our books, see the transparency, mentor. Don't be afraid to invest in grassroots organization, because we are not just the future, we are here now. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, that idea of mentorship and a dialogue between partners and funders. Juan.
So from my side, I think it would be also an invitation, an overall invitation to exploring what is unexplored, to mainly rethinking doing things differently. And I think we've had amazing examples here that show that doing things different is feasible. The pandemic obliged many actors to doing things differently. It obliged grant makers to speed up their processes. It obliged organizations to deploy faster, and weirdly enough, we're seeing that we're all coming back to normal, whatever that normal was before, and we didn't stick to those great changes of flexibility and innovation that were shown during the pandemic. And so the invitation is, things can be different, and the additional effort is worthwhile.
Great, thank you so much. And Brian, final thoughts from you on your call to action.
Hard question, and then so many things I want to say, but I'll stick to one, and I will try not to repeat anyone. It's going to sound silly, and the advice is to essentially never turn down a first conversation with anyone who reaches out and wants to talk to you, because you'll never know, you never know essentially who you will meet that will help you either think in ways or develop new sort of practices that can sort of shape the culture and the operations or the practice of your organization to provide more flexible types of support that really do center those who are trying to grapple with those challenges in the positions of power and decision-making that we are talking about today.
That is a great closing thought. I think for me, one of the themes that's really resonating here is, to be a little bit dramatic, all of our humanity, whether you're a founder or a community or an organization or a donor, we are all, working to solve these challenges together. And I think part of what came up here was really listening to each other, and as Wendo said, mentorship, really sort of accompanying each other on our individual journeys that we're on wherever we sit. And again, I'll circle back to my call to action in the beginning, to remember that we each have power. As individuals, we each have power, no matter where we sit in whatever ecosystem we are part of. So thank you so much to our panelists for this just really rich, honest conversation. And I hope it was helpful to our audience. And I think we've shared our contact details in the chat. Please reach out to any of us. And with that, I will wish you all a good day wherever you are.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.